Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This episode of True Murder is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is the easiest way to create a beautiful website, blog, or online store for you and your ideas. Start a free trial today, no credit card required. Experience Squarespace at squarespace.com and enter offer code TRUEMURDER for a 10% discount. Edward Wayne Edwards, a misguided boy, vowed to be the best criminal ever. He killed scores and scores of people of all ages over a 66-year period and was never apprehended for murder. Included are some of the most famous cases in the past century. The book that we are featuring this evening is It's Me, Edward Wayne Edwards, the serial killer you never heard of, with my special guest, journalist and author and detective John A.Cameron. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, John Cameron.
Well, thanks for having me on, Dan. It's a pleasure to talk about Mr. Edwards. Most people have never heard of this serial killer, and I think they'd be very interested in the story.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's just mind-blowing, and so we better get right into it. Why don't you outline your background, which obviously is very, very, very important to this case. So give us your background, and you have a famous ritualistic serial killer. You were on a task force. So just tell us briefly what your background was before Edward Wayne Edwards came to your attention.
Yeah, certainly. I was a Great Falls, Montana police detective for 24 years. I retired in 2005 at the rank of Sergeant of Detectives, and I was in charge of cold cases for a lot of my career. And when I retired, I went to work for the Montana Board of Pardons and Parole in Deer Lodge Prison, Montana. And my job in that position was to be an analyst for all of the parolees wanting to get out of prison. And that is, I would sit down with them, interview them, review their cases, and make a recommendation to the parole board as to whether or not those people are deserving of an early release. And in 2010, while I was working in this position, I was introduced to a serial killer that just got caught at the age of 76 in Ohio, and his name was Edward Wayne Edwards. And I eventually tied this man to a 1956 Lover's Lane double murder that happened here in Great Falls. And Mr. Edwards in 2010 was actually confessing to Lover's Lane's murders in Ohio and Wisconsin. And so I decided to challenge him with letters, and that began the unraveling of what he had done.
Now let's go back for our audience because. Let's go back for our audience to March 9th, 2009, in Madison, Wisconsin, and they ran a story in the media there of a 30-year-old cold case, Timothy Hack and Kelly Drew, and let's talk about this case a little bit and how this really happened and who came forward. So let's talk about this news story that was in Madison, Wisconsin, generated from a newspaper there. Tell us why they ran this story, this 30-year-old cold case, and what it contained, and then what was the result of them running case in terms of people contacting the police. Tell us a little bit about that first.
Certainly. It was a double Lover's Lane murder of a couple in a car in Madison, Wisconsin, named Timothy Hack and Kelly Drew, and it happened on August 9th of 1980. And Edwards was actually living in Wisconsin in 1980. But in 2009 of March, Edwards had a daughter named April, who was 42 years old at that time, and was watching TV about a cold case from 1980 in Wisconsin. and she recalled that her father had taken her and her brothers to the scene of that double murder. So in 2009, she picks up the phone and she calls the police and says, "I think you should talk to my dad. We were at that scene, and he said there were bodies there." So the police actually took the evidence from the case from 1980 and sent it to the lab, and they recovered DNA, and it matched Edward Wayne Edwards, who was 76 years old in 2009, living down in Louisville, Kentucky with his wife, who he had been married to for 43 years.
Now, one of the interesting things about the murder itself was, and I've never read this actual term, was the hyoid bone was broken. Just tell us briefly, because that'll be important much later on, I think, as we talk about this killer. Tell us about this hyoid bone, and if there is something unusual about that method of killing somebody by breaking that bone.
Yeah, sure. The hyoid bone is a small bone in the neck, and it's used during autopsies, especially when people are strangled, to see the severity of the strangulation or the injury to the neck. And it takes a very quick, severe hit to break the hyoid bone. And in the case in 1980, the victim had a broken hyoid bone. And it turns out in many of Ed Edwards' cases, the victim would have a broken hyoid bone. And that, what it represented was that he was always able to get so close to his victims because of the way he was able to groom himself into them so close and impersonal that they wouldn't even see it coming when the punch occurred. And the punch is called a rabbit punch to the neck, right to the throat, breaks the neck, not the neck, but breaks the hyoid bone, makes you so you can't breathe, but also makes it so you're going to sit there and watch as the terror he's going to inflict on you occurs. That way he has complete control. And that proved true through many of Mr. Edwards' murders over the 6 decades that he killed and got away with it, is that he had groomed his way into the lives of his victims and got it so close to them that he was able to rabbit punch them out of the blue without them even suspecting it was going to happen, and then stage the murder.
Okay, let's go back to before you really, understand the magnitude of what you're entering in, what the story is, how big it is, and how much it's going to have to unravel for you to completely comprehend this. And I'm sure you get an inkling right away, obviously following your instincts as a cold case detective. When detectives go visit him in Louisville, Kentucky, this vicious serial killer that no one really realizes is that, based on the tip from his daughter and they confirming that he was in that area. Well, what does Edward Wayne Edwards look like? What's his health like? What does he look like at 76 years old when they do go to interview him?
Yeah, they went down June of 2009 to interview him in Louisville, Kentucky. He was living in a trailer park with his wife of 43 years. He was about 300 pounds. He was just a really gluttonous-looking slob, you could say. And he knew it was up. And he always had waited for that knock on the door from the police. But he was 76 years old when it finally came. And when it came, here's this guy who's 300 pounds who looks horrible. And that's the vision everybody got once Edward Wayne Edwards was identified as a serial killer, was this 300-pound man totally out of health. And how could he possibly hurt anybody? I mean, that's really what everybody thought. But what they didn't know is that this man had actually been planning his capture his entire life, but had played a game against the criminal justice society to get caught by sending puzzles and anonymous letters and phone calls to police his whole life, teasing them with his identity, because his real name was never Edward Wayne Edwards.
Well, before we get into, I guess, the questioning, because really what happens here, I guess what we'll talk about is in the result of this questioning of Edward Wayne Edwards, despite his appearance that he doesn't look so vicious and they don't know the magnitude of his crimes, they ask him for a DNA sample request. What does he do, and what happens as a result of the request?
He actually submitted to the DNA around June 9th of 2009, And on July 30th of 2009, they got a match on the 1980 Lover's Lane murder in Wisconsin. And it was a match of his semen found on the pants of the female victim. And the female victim had actually been kidnapped, tied up, wrists, ankles, hands bound, and stabbed to death along with the male victim. And he was arrested, and he was transported to Wisconsin and was arraigned for the double murder and sat in that jail for about a year before he went to the press and announced that he had killed others.
In that announcement, what did he proclaim in that announcement to the press? Give us the totality of what he wanted to express. Tell us about that.
Sure. After Mr. Edwards was captured, he was held in Wisconsin for about 9 months. And during the time he was held, he was writing letters to police officers all over the place, trying to get a deal. That's one MO Edwards always had, is once he was caught on any crime, and he was caught on other crimes, but not murder, he would always try to work a deal. And so he started sending letters to police officers in Ohio and Wisconsin telling other murders and that he wanted the death penalty and that he was willing to confess to other murders to get that. Once he found out he couldn't get the death penalty in Wisconsin, he contacted the press in Ohio in June of 2010 and announced that he had killed a 23-year-old man and beheaded him and collected $250,000 worth of insurance. That case got him his death penalty, but he had actually confessed to another Lover's Lane murder in 1977 in Ohio, trying to get the death penalty. But in 1977, they didn't have the death penalty, so therefore he couldn't. So in the end, in June of 2010, Mr. Edwards confessed to 5 murders. 4 of them were Lover's Lanes, parked in their cars and kidnapped and tortured. And one was the actual adoption of a 22-year-old man, waiting 2 years, killing him for $250,000 worth of insurance and collecting and getting away with it in 1996.
While he's imprisoned in Wisconsin in that 9 months, one fascinating thing that, of course, is the center of this entire book that you have is that the FBI discovers something very, very unusual about Edward Wayne Edwards. So tell us what they do discover, the FBI, about Edward Wayne Edwards in that interim 9 months while he's in Wisconsin.
Sure, Mr. Edwards had a lot of interesting things in his life, but he was really well known as an author, a writer. He actually helped produce documentaries, and he was a public speaker. Throughout his life, he went around claiming that he was a reformed criminal, that back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, he was a real bad robber and a burglar, but never a killer. And then in 1969, at age 36, he came out of Leavenworth Prison and wrote a book. And the book was 436 pages, and it was titled Metamorphosis of a Criminal, the True Life Story of Ed Edwards. And that book ended up being a 436-page murder puzzle. He actually documented his entire life from birth up until 1969 when he came out of prison claiming to be reformed, and placed himself in cities all over the country in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, committing horrible burglaries, robberies, and detailing a lot of this in his book. But what he never mentioned in the book was that he killed anybody. And so in the end, it turned out that his book, Metamorphosis of a Criminal, was a murder puzzle that he had written in 1969, and he never got identified as a serial killer until 2010.
Obviously, this man was a masterful con, and we will explain how he becomes this con and why he becomes this con. And we haven't gone into his early life, but I'm waiting for the time when you actually discover that and how you discover his actual background, you know, and from his own family and coworkers and people that he actually knew. But let's talk about his confession to police again, and what police are doing with, like, how you become involved in terms of, he's confessing to 5 murders, but tell us exactly how you get involved, how it is that you become alerted to him specifically?
Certainly, in 2010, while I was working for the Montana Parole Board as the analyst, I was contacted by some police officers and sent a memo about Mr. Edwards because he was back in Ohio in June of 2010. He'd confessed to 5 murders, and there were couples that were killed. We knew that he wrote a book, and the book contained the name of the city that I live in, Great Falls, Montana. Only Mr. Edwards wrote about being in Great Falls, Montana in January of 1956. And he was 22 years old at that time and married to another woman that he had actually married back in 1955. So in 1956, he was actually in my hometown. What we had here was a horrible murder on January 2nd, 1956. And it was a little 16-year-old girl and her 18-year-old boyfriend, Airman, were parked on the banks of the Sun River here in Great Falls, making out in their car, when they were approached by somebody who most likely was dressed like a police officer because the way he controlled the scene. And the killer ordered the two out of the car, made the girl tie up the boy with his belt, put the boy on his knees, and executed the boy 2 shots to the head in front of the girl. He then kidnapped the girl, took her to the top of what's called Mount Royal Road, where there's an old Indian burial site, and put her on her knees and executed her. And this case remained unsolved from 1956 until 2010, when I finally confronted Edward Wayne Edwards in prison about it.
Now, before you get to this confrontation, this book that Edwards wrote, first tell us about, before you actually get a copy of it, and you're going to tell our audience how you come to get a copy of this very rare book. And before you got the book, what did you know about it? And then I want to explain to the audience what happens when you first get that book in your hands and start reading it.
Well, when I first got pages from the book, I actually got about 30 pages faxed to me from a reporter in Wisconsin, because I knew that Great Falls had been mentioned in the book, and there it was, that he had been placing himself in Great Falls, robbing people, 2 people, during the time of our double murder. And so I had a friend here in town who's kind of a crime follower, a book reader, and she had the book, Metamorphosis of a Criminal, and it's a very rare book to find. I think there were only about 3,000 copies made of it. And when we started reading the book, we found the evidence that Edwards was in Great Falls in our double murder, and evidence of other murders in the book. And the way the book is written, it's now clear, after all this time of investigating Mr. Edwards, that this was one highly intelligent serial killer, and this book was nothing but a puzzle of murder of his first 30 years of killing and getting away with it.
What's fascinating is the book cover, and you show what's an amazing aspect of your book is taking actual photos from his Metamorphosis of a Criminal, and very much like the cover, just to show people this stuff is just amazingly ironic. But on the very cover, and again, he designed this, he wrote this, he got this published, he had this published, so he was in creative control here. So on the very cover, he was on the FBI's list of the 10 most wanted. He was a hold-up man, a bank robber, a dangerous character. He spent 14 years in 5 jails. Now he is a writer, a respected citizen, and the head of a family of 5. Metamorphosis of a Criminal. Tell us a little bit more, because I think it's fascinating, too. He even made a religious album, inspirational religious album that he released. So this guy, amazing. And we're talking about a long time ago. We're talking 50 years ago, 40 years ago. So tell us a little bit more about what you found out about his acceptance as this criminal, and like I say, some of the tours he was on, a television program to Tell the Truth, a famous, very popular television program. So tell us a little bit more about some of the touring he did, the motivational speaking he did, which provided him to be able to travel throughout the country while he was on parole.
Sure, and when you look at the cover of his book, it's really, the entire cover was a puzzle. What he places there are two men on the front cover, and Edwards was two men. On the top left side is the killer holding what appears to be a knife in hand and ready to attack. And on the bottom right side, on the right is the good side, is the man in the suit wearing the hat with the attaché, presenting himself as a very highly professional preacher, doctor of psychiatry, CIA agent. How Edwards portrayed himself throughout life. He was two people. He was married for 43 years with 5 children, and he was a good guy on that side. And then he had this horrible killing side, and he used his family as the alibi. And so when he says that now he is a writer and a respected citizen and the head of a family of 5 on the front of his cover, that was a ruse. And then he ran around the country portraying himself just as that, as a reformed criminal, a good writer. But in fact, what he was doing is showing up in their communities, portraying all that, and then killing in their hometowns and setting people up. That was his MO. And so with the title Metamorphosis of a Criminal, what it really meant in the end was metamorphosis of a killer, the best serial killer ever. And Edwards was always about his count. How many people could he kill? And he kept track of them throughout his life. So while he was traveling throughout 1970s and 80s, showing up in churches and law enforcement academies and lawyers' schools and high schools, junior high schools, preaching, don't get into crime where, it'll lead down a bad path. He was actually finding his victims and killing them. And his publishing of his books and his religious motivational albums were really a sign that Mr. Edwards was a Satanist. He basically took everything from the Catholics and turned it into Satanism because he was so abused at the age of 7 in a Catholic orphanage that he just set out to become the best killer ever. And that's what the title of his book meant, Metamorphosis of a Criminal.
In this autobiographical book, as he claims, he talks about his early life. So you just alluded to it. Let's talk about his very early life and how he ended up in an Catholic orphanage and then his treatment, according to him, therein.
Yes, Mr. Edwards was born in 1933, and he was given the name Charles Edward Myers. And in 1938, at the age of 5, he found out that the mother and father that he was living with, that he thought was his mother and father, were actually his aunt and uncle, and that his real mother was in prison and was about to be released in 1938, and that his real father nobody knew, and his father never cared for him. So when he was 5 years old, he finds out that his parents that he thought were his parents up to that point are no longer his parents. He's handed back to mother, who has just come out of prison for theft. And within 8 months of her coming out, she dies of a gunshot wound to her stomach, but lives for 6 days from August 2nd, 1938, until August 8th of 1938. And after she is dead and buried, they change his name from Charles Edward Myers to Edward Wayne Edwards, stick him in a Catholic orphanage in Palmerdale, Ohio, and he's very little, and he's very young, and he's a bedwetter, and he's beaten by the kids, by the nuns, and then eventually sexually assaulted, and by age 11 escapes the orphanage in 1945 and starts killing people, and does it until his capture in 2009.
It was interesting, you have in the book, you had access to the nun inquiring what little Charles wanted to be, or Edward Wayne Edwards wanted to be when he grew up, and what was his response?
The best criminal ever is what he wanted to be, and that was at age 11. But, people see that, the best criminal ever. Edwards is every serial killer you can imagine tied up in one, because he's not addicted to the sexual side of most serial killers. He is addicted to the kill and the setup of an innocent person. And he's also a criminal, which means he was a bank robber, a forger, fraud artist, burglar, every type of crime you can imagine he had aced. And when he was actually in Great Falls in 1956, where he killed a couple here, he was burglarizing this town the whole time he was here, stealing everything. So not only was he a serial killer, but he was a criminal. and highly intelligent with a very high IQ. So his whole goal was just to kill people, make sure it was someone close to, like a family member, that would fall for the crime. And over again, he set people up throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And then in the 2000s, he actually became the best at it. The last 9 years of his life, he had some of the best setups he'd ever done.
Again, we've got to go backwards because now we have to find out how it came that you corresponded with Edward Wayne Edwards. And tell us also about the meeting and the matchup with a fellow detective, Neil, and tell us how that meeting came to be and how you joined forces and what was the plan on how to contact Edward Wayne Edwards. Tell us about that whole effort.
Well, being a former cold case detective, I had that 1956 murder that I was aware of that happened in Great Falls, and knew that it had never been unsolved or never been solved. And so I just decided that I would write Mr. Edwards a letter and ask him if he would just confess to it. And this was about 6 weeks into me actually finding out who he was. I had really researched him and got his book and got all of his records and interviewed some of his family and stuff. And I wanted to just see if he would be willing to say, yes, I did it, confess, and be done with it, since he was going to be executed anyway in Ohio. And I didn't get a response back. And I had a friend named Neil, who's about 55 years old, highly intelligent, had studied Chinese and Greek, and had studied the Book of the Dead, had studied Satanism, but in a good way, and just was a real puzzle solver. And early on in the investigation, after tying Mr. Edwards to the 1956 murder and realizing that he just confessed to one in 1977, one in 1980, and one in 1996, I knew that he had been killing since at least 1956, all the way up until his capture. And his MO matched that of what was known as the Zodiac Killer, a killer who terrorized San Francisco 1968 to 1970 and sent anonymous letters and was a writer and killed couples on lovers' lanes. I suspected that Edwards could have been the Zodiac Killer because he was released from Leavenworth Prison just before it started, and he matched the composite. So I contacted my friend Neil and showed him what is known as the Zodiac Killer's identity cipher, which was actually a puzzle of 13 characters sent April 20th, 1970. And the Zodiac said that when that puzzle was solved, it would name his name. And Neil, having the highly intelligent brain, was able to crack it, and it actually named Edward Edwards, which is 13 characters, the same amount of characters as the Zodiac Killer cipher. And so we confronted Edwards in a letter as being the Zodiac Killer after we solved that cryptogram, and that began our relationship with Mr. Edwards. So
that he responded in that he got a lot of correspondence, but he was intrigued, wasn't he? So you and Neil really had cracked this in terms of understanding what he had first expressed in his book, Metamorphosis of a Criminal, and then that tie-in through the book, through the Egyptian history and science fiction, that Book of the Dead. So you guys put it all together. He was impressed with that, that you came to that conclusion, wasn't he?
Well, that was his whole goal through life, was that somebody identify him. And that's why in the Zodiac case he sent so many puzzles that actually contained his identity. And once we cracked that puzzle, he actually was thrilled. And I'll just read a little passage, which is very interesting, one of the first letters. And it says, "Dear John and Neil," and this is after we confronted him about being the Zodiac Killer and that we cracked the Zodiac ciphers. And here's what he said. "Dear John and Neil, it's me. You say you won the Zodiac game? I remember a guy in Deer Lodge back in '56 they called the Zodiac. He killed a guy in Great Falls. I may be 77, but I don't forget things. Good luck with your Zodiac game. If you write about me, make sure you say nice things. Your friend, Ed Edwards. P.S. I love you too." We had actually forgiven Mr. Edwards in a letter when we confronted him because we knew he was Catholic. and we knew that he was destroyed in a Catholic church. And we knew that that's the biggest thing as Catholics is forgiveness. And he was really actually looking for that. He was looking for those puzzles to be solved and for somebody to relate to what he was actually up to. And that really began a horrible 9 months of confronting Mr. Edwards and exchanging letters and phone calls, and just the division it created between everybody, law enforcement agencies everywhere. And it was a pretty horrible time, but it was well worth doing.
Yes, you chronicle the resistance to the evidence that you had uncovered. And so even the FBI, you talk about the FBI initially, you had a sort of seemed like a meaningful conversation, and then it was a freeze out. So tell us about the response from officials wherever you contact. Tell us about who you might have contacted, or who you did contact, and their response to this new evidence as you describe it.
Well, at first they were skeptical. Mr. Edwards basically was back in Ohio. He confessed to the 5 murders. They put out memos to all the agencies in the country asking if they had unsolved murders, and other agencies all over were investigating him. But what they didn't understand was who he really was and what he was up to. Edwards was always a game player with the justice system, and while he sat in prison those last 2 years writing letters to authorities, every one of those letters was a puzzle to be followed as to what he had really done, and he was looking for people to challenge him. And I tried to explain this to the FBI, to the local police, the sheriff, agencies that had murders, but nobody really wanted to hear it, because in most cases where Edwards killed somebody else went down for the crime. That is how he worked. And once a man is convicted of a crime and he's innocent, he's stuck, and the system shuts down. And I couldn't understand why there was such resistance to Mr. Edwards at the beginning, but I found out as the investigation went on that he had been an FBI informant in 1950 and never stopped all the way up until his capture. But unfortunately, what he was doing was informing on his own murders that he had already designed to steer the evidence to somebody innocent and set up. And so he became an informant, released out of prison throughout his life for informing on his own murders. And the system shut down in 2010 when he got identified and hoped it went away.
His daughter did say that his father was adamant about having relationships with police, and there was times when he was questioned by police, and then they would take off in the middle of the night from the area. But there was also, he had relationships with, you said, a captain of a police force. I mean, he really went out of his way to have relationships with police officials, didn't he?
That is actually what his wife told me, that whenever they moved everywhere. They lived everywhere in the United States from 1968 until his capture. He would immediately go to the police departments and make friends with him. But his name wasn't Edward Edwards when he did that. And their names weren't the Edwards family either. He had them under assumed identity wherever he was. But he always demanded to be called Wayne, no matter what his last name was going to be, with his identities. He was always wanting to be called Wayne because that way he could remember exactly who he is and what he's doing. But yes, I have pictures of him in 1979 with the captain of the Atlanta Police Department, arm around him, saying it's his best friend. Well, Edwards was actually in that city killing children in 1979. And when he got caught there for arson in 1982, he had a police uniform that he had been using. And it turns out that is his ruse. He would make friends with the police, obtain their uniforms, and then impersonate them and kill in their communities, and then steer the evidence to whoever he decided to steer it to, and then screw with the police by sending letters that would either taunt them or steer the evidence more towards the man he wants to set up. And just over and over again in cities throughout the United States, he set people up and got some executed and some are serving. There's quite a few serving still right now.
How is it that what do you actually get from, you say 9 months of correspondence and you're pushing for more information. Give us the gist of what you actually got from Edward Wayne Edwards in terms of evidence of other murders.
From the time I confronted him in June of 2010, until he died April 7th, 2011. Neil and I were writing him back and forth by letter, trying to get him just to confess to being the Zodiac Killer. But as it went on, we tied him to other famous killings because that really was his M.O. And the most famous one that we tied him to right away, besides, the killing in Great Falls in 56 and the possibility that he's the Zodiac Killer, but the Joe Monet Ramsey case in 1996 in Boulder, Colorado. We confronted Edwards about that also because the way the Joe Monet Ramsey note was signed, it was signed Victory SBTC. And what it ended up meaning in the end was victory, which is a Christian phrase taken to the dark side by Edwards, and SBTC stood for signed by the cross. The Zodiac Killer was always famous for signing his letters with the cross and circle. And what the cross and circle is actually the zodiac, which goes back into ancient Egyptian history and time where there were very evil men such as Osiris and Isis and Herod and just these evil satanic gods, I guess you'd call it, in those thousands of years ago days. Edwards wanted to be known as the best killer ever, and he wanted to be known as a godlike image when it was revealed, because he went on for so long and tied it all to either Christianity or Judaism or Islam. That's how he worked. He terrorized religion because he knew that people would divide that way. And he just led us down a path for 60 years of killing, setting people up, and watching us as the system killed.
What were we're going to have the ability to talk about some of these, well, not all of these famous crimes that he was tied to and why. You did the due diligence, you did the dogged detective work. Of course, you place him there, not he could have been there, that he was definitely there. So, and then the MOs match. But what are the commonalities that you're already seeing in these murders? Because what I didn't realize was the extent of some of the contact with authorities after these murders, the media or families. So tell us what you're already seeing in terms of Wayne Edwards' MO or signature, the commonalities already that you're seeing.
Yeah, since the release of the book, it's really been amazing. People read the book and then they kind of see the MO also. Well, the MO is fairly simple once you see it. When you're looking at a murder that is all over the headlines, and let's just say in the 90s when the cable news networks were really big on murder cases, when you had a case where, number one, it was somebody killed on a holiday such as Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, 4th of July. Edwards was a ritualistic killer, killing over and over and over again on Christian holidays and the 12 days of Christmas between the 25th and the 6th of January, because he's a Satanist. And he would steer the letters and the evidence after somebody else was arrested to look for a Satanist. And most organizations that got letters from Edwards probably blew them off as a nut. But many of his letters contained actually his identity. They were always signed anonymously or signed with portrayed, but written by a female. But inside the letters were always clues as to the true identity of who the real killer was. And that's why my letters and Neil's letters to Edwards became so important, because he was communicating with us in prison, and he knew they were reading everything he was sending, and they were reading everything we were sending. And it was a game of code, and that's what they do in prisons, is they write in code always, so that way their letters get through. But he had given hints and clues as to the letters to look for in some of the biggest cases that we attached to him. And in those cases, we recovered the letters, and there was the identity inside of them. And in the end, as Edwards became very good in the 2000s, he was a blogger and a website owner, and he was actually just challenging everybody throughout the late 90s and all the way up until his death to identify him on some of the most famous murder sites out there, because he was actually responsible, and he loved to go in there and just mess with people and see if they'd figure out who he is.
Tell us a little bit more about, just to really demonstrate this, because I think that you have included in your book some things that are not so common knowledge about the John Bonet case itself. Now that it seems to be, I guess, accepted that the mother that a lot of people thought had something to do with, or the father, that they had nothing to do with this murder, tell us how you uncovered that Edwards was involved in the John Bonet. Tell us the clues he gave you, and tell us how you confirmed it. You and Neil are doing handwriting analysis. Again, he's breaking code, comparing the book and to the Zodiac and those letters. So tell us about that.
Well, Joe Bonet Ramsey, who was killed in 1996 on Christmas, was actually Edwards' 50th year of killing. His first killing was 1946, January 6th, in Chicago, and that killing ended up being a little 6-year-old girl, just like Joe Bonet Ramsey, who was sleeping in her house with her parents, just like Joe Bonet Ramsey, who was lured out of her house, actually, came with her killer out of the house into a basement, dismembered, spread around the streets of Chicago, and then Edwards taunted the press with letters and phone calls, and they were very immaturish. They said things like, "Please stop me, I can't control myself, I'm going to kill more." And he was 13 years old when he did it. And he actually had started killing when he was 11. And that would be his MO, is to kill on a holiday ritualistically. So when we tied him to the Joe Bonet Ramsey case in 1996, it started to unravel that he actually put up websites to his killings that he had done in 46 and 47. And the one famous website that everybody should go to if they want to read the true story of Ed Edwards and his first 3 murders, it's called blackdahliasolution.org. And that is a website he put up in 2002, just before Christmas of 2002. And that website was the solution to identify the real Zodiac Killer and how long he'd been killing. The evidence came about. I've been working on it for 5 years. I published the book about 8 months ago. And since the release of the book, all the people that are out there finding the cases just have to look for the person screaming, "I didn't do it," the press frenzy on the case, the ritualistic nature of the case itself. Are they laid out? Are they staged? Are they missing limbs? Are they beheaded? Edwards beheaded people his whole life, which was a signature satanic thing, and drowning them and laying them out in water. He did everything based on ancient Egyptian Satanism, I guess I would call it. The Book of the Dead, Aleister Crowley back in the 19th century, who wrote the Book of the Dead, or had studied the Book of the Dead and wrote his own 3-part book about bringing on a change of, murder and mayhem. Edwards studied that throughout his adolescent years and actually did it, and continues to do it, even though he's dead, because there's people sitting on death row right now that will be executed for his murders, and he will be sitting up in his afterlife laughing at the system.
Tell us about, you talked about the 9 months of correspondence with him, and I wanted to get all of the murders that you could confirm in that period of time, because then you go on to research after that. So tell us about Edwards' death, his demise, and how that changes the course of your investigation.
Certainly. We had connected him, of course, to the early 56 murder, and then we connected to Joe Bonet in 96, but there's a 50-year period of what did you do in between? I had no idea the extent of where it was going to go. I thought it was bad enough that he was the Zodiac Killer, that he killed Joe Bonet, and that he had been killing since 1946. I just didn't understand the magnitude of it, and his letters kept telling us that we didn't know the whole story, because we were kind of cocky with him, telling him, "Ha-ha, we got you," and he was basically telling us, "Oh, no, you don't know the whole story." And so he was in prison up until April 7th in 2011, and I was actually going to go interview him about April 11th. But he died naturally in prison at the age of 77 years old, and had heart ailments, diabetes, But he had actually always, when he got caught, attempted to kill himself in some way. I always wonder if in fact he helped himself along. He had actually asked us to send him this candy that he should have never had, but we sent him about $100 worth of candy that he wanted, and he was a diabetic, and he got it. And he did die shortly after that, but I don't know if that played any part in it at all, but it was very strange when we were exchanging these letters with him about this candy issue, and why did he want that so badly. So it was, the whole letters was just a big game between him and society, and it was the same between Neil and I and him. It was figure me out. You know, he was never going to give it up and say who he was at the end. And I was naive to think that if I was even going to get to sit down with him, that he was even going to tell me anything truthful. What he would have done is just given me clues to follow, because that's really what it was all about, is he wants it to go on forever. And since the release of the book, it's just unbelievable what he's done. He announced his count in 1996 on a blog, and it was between 1946 and 1996, he killed 500 people in every part of the country, Canada, Mexico, and got away with it, and he didn't get caught till 2009. So it's unknown how many more there are, but I've found 240 now. And you can see a lot of that on my website, coldcasecameron.com.
Well, we're going to use this as an opportunity to talk a little bit about the sponsor of True Murder, this episode. I don't know if you happen to see the most recent Super Bowl and the very cool commercial for Squarespace with the dude, a.k.a. Jeff Bridges, but he has partnered with Squarespace to bring his unique project to life. And Jeff and his friends have created an album of soothing and relaxing sounds, guided meditations, and stories designed to lull you to sleep. Visit Squarespace to see Jeff Bridges' amazing website, dreamingwithjeff.com. Now, with Squarespace, you can create a unique, one-of-a-kind website. Squarespace features an elegant interface and beautiful templates with a dedicated 24/7 customer support. Now, every website comes with a free online store and a free domain name with your first annual plan. Your website will scale to look great on any device, and with cover pages, you have a gorgeous one-page online presence in minutes. Now, whether you want to create a fantastic website or blog, an e-commerce store, portfolio, or all of the above, you can express your ideas powered by an elegant yet intuitive platform. Start a free trial today, no credit card required, and when you sign up at squarespace.com, please use the offer code TRUEMURDER for a 10% discount off your first purchase. I would like to thank Squarespace very much for their support of this episode of True Murder. Squarespace, build it beautiful. Now, John, you were speaking about this incredible claim of 500 murders in a 66-year period of time of killing. The book, once Edwards was dead, you continued to look at this book, and then you went online, like you say, and tried to find out what his presence was online. So tell us a little bit more about the investigation once he's dead and how you are continuing to find other murders that you can attribute to Edward Wayne Edwards positively.
Sure. When he died April 7, 2011, I really thought that this would be kind of the end of it, and we would just write a book about what he had done, and that would be it. Well, what actually happened was I took his book, Metamorphosis of a Criminal, and I took a copy of it, and I ripped it apart, and I scanned it into a PDF file that was searchable. Edwards is a writer, and because he's a writer, that means, you can catch similarities in his writings. So I was wondering, if he's a writer and he's killing, is he blogging once the computer age came along? Because the big years for him were 1946 to 1996, and that's 50 years of killing, 500 kills, and he announces that on Google Blogs on January 8th, 1997, that he killed 500 people. So I took his book and started searching phrases, and that's when I found the phrases in his book on the blackdahliasolution.org website. And that began to unravel really what Mr. Edwards had done, because now I had a website where he actually gives the details of how he did all these killings many years and how you break the codes down. And it turned out everything he said on that website was exactly what Neil had already used 8 months earlier. And we were right. And so then it began a process of starting from 1945 and just doing a timeline of his life all the way up until his capture. And that's really what you do in a homicide investigation in any case. You take your victim, you take your suspect, and you do a timeline of their life. Well, Mr. Edwards had so many victims and had set up so many suspects that the timeline took 3 years to do, and the investigation never stops. Even to this day, after the publication of the book last year, there's so many other murders to talk about that are out there, but it'll never end, and that's really what he wanted it to do. He knew it would be revealed, and in the end, he began blogging that it would be almost 300 years, he thought, before someone would figure it out. But we were very fortunate to have, I worked in Deer Lodge Prison. The Zodiac Killer had actually mentioned to one of his victims that he had been in Deer Lodge Prison. And I was just in the right position at the right time in 2010 with the right Zodiac Killer dropped in my lap and the right Lover's Lane murder in 1956 to kind of unravel the puzzle. And I was hoping the book would be the end of the puzzle, but I knew it wouldn't be. I knew that when it was released that it would just open the floodgates, and it has. And it's been fun, but it's also just draining, seeing the system still play out to his false leads. And that's what the Zodiac Killer was always about, was the false leads, making fun of the police, teasing them with his identity, saying, ha ha, I'm smarter than you. And that's what Edwards was.
Tell us a little bit about another very controversial case. As people know, America's Most Wanted was created with John Walsh after his son Adam was murdered. This will also explain part of Edward Wayne Edwards' particular MO in a kidnap, ransom note, but no real interest in gaining a ransom or returning the kidnapped victim. So tell us a little bit about that. Adam Walsh, kidnapping.
Sure. Most people know the John Walsh of America's Most Wanted. And in 1981, his son Adam, who was actually a blonde-haired 6-year-old boy, Joan Benet Ramsey was a blonde-haired 6-year-old girl. Well, Adam was kidnapped from a store, and his head was found floating in a canal a few weeks later, in August, actually, right around the time that Edwards always killed between the date his mother was shot and the day his mother was buried, August 2nd to August 10th. Adam Walsh's head was found on August 10th, 1981, floating in a canal. And they never did figure out who did it. A serial killer named Otis Toole actually confessed and then recanted. But in the end, the Zodiac Killer actually sent John Walsh letters in 1991. And the public didn't know any of this until 2006, when John Walsh finally went public and actually published what are called the Scorpion letters. Those letters were actually sent by Edwards, the Zodiac Killer. And it turned out that in 1981, Edwards was living in Florida and traveling to Atlanta, where he was killing children and dressing up as a policeman. And he had killed 24 little children, 1979, 80, 81 in Atlanta. He traveled to Florida and killed Adam Walsh, actually, in the backyard of one of his ex-wives, a girl named Marlene, who he was married to in 1959. Edwards liked to go to the towns where he had relatives or an ex-wife or someone he knew and create terror. And the Adam Walsh case created terror, started the program America's Most Wanted. And Edwards taunted John Walsh his whole life with false letters because Edwards was America's Most Wanted. And John Walsh did many, many stories on Edwards' murders, but they were always placed on somebody else because that's really the design of Edwards' murders, was the setup. So the John Walsh, Adam Walsh case didn't even come into the picture until after Edwards had died, and we found the scorpion letters and then found Edwards down in Atlanta at the time and in Florida. And it just really unraveled what he did is he just killed every type of victim there is, whether it be a boy or an infant, a 6-year-old, a 20-year-old, a 40-year-old. It never mattered. What mattered was to do it ritualistically, create terror, and set somebody up.
What was the importance of lipstick, and how common was it, and how many murders was it dealt with? And then you can explain the famous lipstick murderer case and this tie in.
Well, certainly. Actually, one of Edwards' last murders was June 14th, 2008 on Fort Bragg. And in that murder, he basically drowned a pregnant female in a tub, and he wrote on lipstick with the Zodiac sign. And in that case, a man named Edgar Patino, who was the boyfriend of the drowned girl, actually pled guilty to that crime to avoid getting the death penalty in 2010. And case ended up being one of Edwards' last setups. And I confronted Edgar Patino as to why would you plead guilty to a murder you didn't do? And he sent me a letter. And actually, the reason that he pled guilty is because he knew that they were going to kill him. They were offering him a deal or the death penalty. And it's amazing the thought process of that when you have the death penalty hanging over your head. Most people think there's no way I would confess to doing something I didn't do. But when you have the death penalty hanging over your head, the standard answer I got from every one of these guys in prison on Edwards' murder was, how am I going to prove I'm innocent if I'm dead?
Now, the other part of this is you have to do the searches to make sure that he was actually in these places at that time. And again, some people might say this is too unbelievable that he happens to be everywhere in these most famous murders, but yet no one has put it together at all until you guys came together, and with great difficulty you guys put this together. So the idea with all these murders that you were tying in there, tell us what that commonality is between all of these murders, that you are unequivocal that this is a proof that they're all done by Edward Wayne Edwards.
The biggest commonality in his murders was he tied them to his book, Metamorphosis of a Criminal. So you have to understand, when he wrote that book, he had been killing from 1945 until he published the book in 1972. But in the book, he actually created a timeline of where he was, when he was, what state, what city. And what he did after publishing the book was went around creating the exact same murders he had done from 45 to 72 and tying them to the book. That way, the MO, once discovered, is you just have to read my book and look at my criminal records, and you'll see I was there. And that's exactly how it played out. I have his criminal records on my website, and they go all the way back to 1949, and they go all the way up to his death. And it's amazing where this man was. He was in every major city of the U.S., and he had FBI files on him in at least half of the states where he had been either caught for robbery or burglary and was informing. So the information actually always came from Edwards. It was always out there. And when the information on the murders wasn't out there, he did it by anonymous letters to either the editors of the papers, the police departments that had the murders, or to the victims' families. And in the Joe Ramsey case, in the end, I received a call from Patsy Ramsey's family here just recently, and they got the book. They saw an article about me in the Globe and read the article, and they were just astounded and are actually quite upset that the press hasn't said anything. That family was destroyed basically by the killer himself. And in the end, Edwards taunted Patsy Ramsey through anonymous bloggings from 2002 until 2006, till she died, actually, giving her the details of how he did it under assumed name. And it's been very horrible I knew that he had killed Joan Benet, but I didn't know the details of what he had done and what he had done to them. And after speaking with them, it's just horrible. They were actually from Atlanta, and Atlanta was very important to Edwards. That's where it all started. And he targeted the Ramseys probably 20 years in advance to kill their firstborn later on in life. That's how he worked. He would groom his way into somebody in the military and take their firstborn son or daughter, or set up a husband for cheating on his wife. He picked his victims. He didn't just drive around kidnapping people. He knew who he was going to kill and how the setup was going to go long in advance of doing it.
You gained a lot of really incredible information from his wife, who he's married to for 43 years, and very much some of the wives that are wives of serial killers, they claim and have been proven to be unbeknownst to them what their evil deeds that their husband was doing for all those years. Tell us what you did get, what the most profound information that you gleaned from speaking with his wife, Kay.
Well, prior to his wife, Kay, there was actually a wife named Jeanette, and the most profound information on the entire case came from Jeanette, and she was with him in 1955-56. And the importance of that is she was a 17-year-old Mormon girl living in Idaho Falls in 1955 when Edwards showed up under an assumed name with a pregnant girlfriend and basically killed his pregnant girlfriend, kidnapped Jeanette White after convincing her to go with, raped her, and forced her to drive around the country for 6 months while he participated in some horrible murders in Chicago, Montana, California, Omaha, Nebraska, and Florida. And she was the driver, and the ruse was they would portray themselves as a happily married family man with a pregnant wife, and he'd have a military uniform or a cop uniform or a doctor, dress up as a doctor, and he would groom into the lives of the people he was going to kill, and then drive away with his wife. She didn't participate in the killings, but she participated in the leaving the scene, and she never was interviewed until we found her in 2012, and it was the most intense interview I've ever heard on the phone. She said when she got in the car in 1955, within 5 minutes he had her, raped her, and that was the beginning of what he was going to do with her. He was just going to drag her around and kill. Then he got caught and went to Deer Lodge Prison in 1956 here in Montana for robbery, and nobody ever talked to her. So he ends up marrying Kay Edwards in 1968 after he gets out of prison and does the exact same thing with her, only he does it with her for 43 years. And she was just a wealth of information.
Well, give us some of that. We don't want to give everything away, but, I mean, this book is just a treasure trove of this kind of stuff. It's a true crime goldmine here. So tell us about what did she say? What both of them did say about what he revealed to them. Obviously, they weren't witnesses to the murders, but what did they say about some of the things that he mentioned to them?
Well, their whole life was based like this. Kay and Ed were married for 43 years. They had 5 children. They have 11 grandchildren. And they would spend maybe a year, maybe 2 years in one place, sometimes in a campground, but always somewhere else every 2 years, and burn down the house when they left. Ed was an arsonist. He loved to burn, and that's part of the satanic thing of his. And so he would basically make his wife watch the kids in a campground for months on end while they'd live in the summer, say in Colorado, while he traveled around and killed everywhere around Colorado. She detailed the police coming over and questioning her about Jimmy Hoffa and Ed and her leaving Florida, and this is in 1979, 77, somewhere around there, and taking off and going into Atlanta, where he starts the Atlanta child killings. So she was witness to a lot of events that the police were after Ed, but she didn't know what he was doing. All she was there for was to take care of the kids and survive. She's almost as if she has the Stockholm Syndrome. She was a captive for 43 years, the worst serial killer there's ever been, and she said she would not have gone against anything he did. You just went with the program. And even after his capture, she just said, I just didn't quite understand it all until he was put away. And now she kind of understands how manipulative he was, but she still can't believe the extent of what he'd done, and she just felt like he was always two different people.
She had given you something from her collection, her own private things, an article that Edwards had clipped out, and with it was, you included in the book, and it's profound. So tell us, there's two parts of it. It looks like it's taped together, but tell us what was in the more profound part of this. What was included in this that she gave you that Edwards had saved all those years?
Sure. Edwards loved to save articles about his exploits, but this one was profound because it was sent in March of 1971. And what it is, it's an interview that Edwards actually gave the Akron Beacon Journal in 1971, and he demanded that they not use his name. But in the interview, he says that he knew who the Zodiac Killer was, and that the Zodiac Killer had spent time in Deer Lodge Prison in Montana with him. And that alone was the piece of evidence that was needed to identify the Zodiac Killer, because in 1969, when the Zodiac killed the couple on the beach at Lake Berryessa, he had said he had been in Deer Lodge Prison, Montana. And what nobody understood was he had been there, but not in 1969. He had been there in 1956 to 59. And it was a clue. And that interview he gave was a clue put out right at the time, at the height of the Zodiac Terror going on all over the country. That article was played throughout the Associated Press. And here was the real Zodiac Killer telling them to look towards Deer Lodge Prison, and you'll find the Zodiac Killer. And it ended up being the truth. That's where he was.
Incredible. Now, you've talked about what has happened since this book has been released, and I would imagine some type of firestorm to a certain degree. So let's talk about first the reaction from police and prosecution, those type of authorities, and then we'll move on to the media and the public response.
Well, the action from authorities has actually always been negative. I mean, it still remains today, because the facts are that the killer was inside and was guiding, trials and people being executed and people being sentenced to life in prison, and there's no way they want to open this bucket of worms. And so I don't ever expect to see them come on board on any of it. They just have always wanted to go away. And the public is divided. I've had a great response from people, and phone calls, and emails, and other cases. But the biggest thing that's come about is I knew there would be many more cases, and it's just phenomenal. When I wrote the book, I had them at around 120 murders. Now I have them at around 240, and I know that he killed 500. So there's a lot more work to do, but I got so many people out there, investigators, that are helping and sending connections to some of the cases. So it's working out really well.
So you've had some validation of the work that you and Neil have done, in terms of from people you respect that are not tied to these outcomes or these past decisions.
No, it's to the victims' families. It's been awesome. The Ramseys, that was probably the biggest validation of it all. But that came just recently. There's other cases where I've made close friends with many of Edwards' victims' survivors, and they see it, but they also see the pushback on this. It's not only pushback from law enforcement, but Edwards manipulated the media. He got inside his own murder documentaries. He was always right in front of everybody. And the media, it was really responsible for the destruction of many of the innocent people that he set up, because it looked so obvious that they must have done it. So they reported it that way. And that's exactly what happened to the Ramseys, and that's what happened to every one of Ed's cases. It was always designed to destroy an innocent person, kill an innocent person, and set up an innocent person. And that way you're not only killing, but you're just creating terror and horrible forever. It's going to go on a long time, because he was alive for 66 years killing, and there'll be many more.
You don't really make this book an indictment of the media, though, or the prosecutors that pushed cases, like you say, where a guy pled guilty because the death penalty was on the table and that was it. So it's not out of the question for somebody to plead guilty to something they didn't do. But what has the media, and who have you approached, and what has the media's, major media, what has been their response to the claims that you can wrap up a bunch of unsolved cases or wrongful convictions or both with this book?
It's been really negative. They have not really wanted to put it out. The only actual international publication that did was the Globe. And I did appear on Coast to Coast Radio upon the release, and that was a great response on that program. But for the most part, no, the national media is who Edwards, as the Zodiac, always targeted. It was always about targeting the editors of the papers and the media with the Zodiac Killer and targeting them with false letters. So throughout his life, what he would do is kill someone and hide the body. And then he would lead the media to the body through anonymous letters to the newspaper. And then he would collect the reward under assumed name because the body's been found. And he would always pick his victims who were wealthy, so he knew there'd be a big financial gain to plant the body, find it, and collect the reward. And then once the innocent man was arrested, Edwards would send those editors another letter and taunt them with, "You got the wrong guy." There are going to be many, many more letters that he sent. Whether or not many of the news organizations are going to release them remains to be seen. But he always made sure that once the wrong guy went down for the crime, that he would return to the media and taunt them with, "You got the wrong guy." And a lot of that is the reason why they don't want to expose Ed Edwards, because it's pretty horrible. It was easy to use reporters to destroy people because they don't have to give up their sources. Well, their source was actually the killer. And so it creates quite a problem.
Are you surprised or disappointed at because I believe, and I would believe the audience would be listening to this as well and realize that this is a very controversial book, just by nature of what you were saying, what you were claiming, and having, again, the media upended, wrongful convictions, what we thought was the total of this. It just seems to be if you were to explain it in 5 minutes, it'd be like, oh my God, it almost sounds fictional. How could it be all tied in there? But you state a very, very, very compelling case. You did dogged detective work to place him here, handwriting analysis, cryptograms analyzed by your cohort or your partner Neil. This is not a sensationalistic ploy to sell books. You have your background. Your credibility is not to be shaken. Have you disappointed or surprised by the lack of the media even giving you a chance to explain the controversy or take the controversy at face value but challenge you? Are you surprised or disappointed by that non-challenge?
Well, I was in the beginning, and I'm talking about the beginning of the investigation back in 2010 before I wrote the book. I'm really not a book writer or an author. I'm a police officer, and I kind of wrote the book in a form of an investigation and just laid it out and let you guys. I'm not surprised at all anymore of the negativity towards it, and it doesn't bother me at all. I've had such great response from the victims' families all over the U.S. and from all over the country, from people that were really hurt by this man. That's really what it was all about, and just getting the story out there. I was really hoping that the press would pick up on it in 2011 when he died and just put it out there and let the police do their investigation. But they never investigated Ed Edwards fully after his capture. The FBI never got involved. They never did a full examination of what he had done. And we were able to do it because we weren't police officers. Edwards was in prison and had a lawyer. Police couldn't contact him and say, "Hey, I want to know about this, I want to know about that," because they had a lawyer. But we weren't police officers, so we were able to confront him, but it really was the solving of that Zodiac cryptogram at the very beginning of the thing that unraveled who he was. He's the Zodiac Killer. He's the real guy. And he's been alive for 77 years, and he's been killing for 66 of those. What has he been doing? And that's what the book is about, a timeline of his life.
What was the relationship, before we talk about the toll it had on you, I guess, this 9 months, but tell us just about the relationship that ended up being developed. How trusting was he of you? Describe the dynamic between you over that ensuing 9 months.
Well, it was really interesting at the beginning because Neil and I had both sent Edwards a letter after Neil had solved the Zodiac identity cipher and had named Edwards. And when Edwards got the letters, he thought that Neil and I were actually one person playing a game against a serial killer who portrayed himself as two people his whole life. And in the first letter to us, you'll see at the very end, it's P.S., am I to call you John or Neil? And I knew I had gotten him. I knew I had gotten to him once he answered like that, because that's exactly what the intention was. Edwards was two people. He was on the dark side, and he was on the good side. And Neil and I confronted him like that. Neil knew the dark side and took all of the cryptograms that he had solved and used the words in those cryptograms right back at Edwards, and Edwards just fell in love with it, actually. Neil forgave him, and the two actually became close, and it became very scary for that period of 9 months, wondering if Edwards was actually planning to get us some way. He actually said in a letter he was sending somebody out to talk to us, and, well, what do we expect? A serial killer sending someone out to talk to you. It was very scary, and the fact that he died was actually a good thing. That man alive, there's not a police officer in the world that would have ever caught him confronting him. He would have taken away someone close to you. That's how evil he was.
Now, you talk about the confrontation that you and Neil, and you specifically more so, confronted him. When you did confront him about these past crimes, did you ever just coin the question, why? Did he ever come to that, admit to why?
No, because the why of it was so in depth that most people would never understand what he was really up to. Because he was religious when he was very young, and because he was put into that Catholic orphanage and then destroyed there, he really played a game against society as running around as portraying a Satan almost, your best friend killing your daughter, So he was so good at the smooze, and he was a good-looking man. Everybody liked him. He invited everybody in. He didn't have to jump out the car and grab people. They all came to him. They invited him into his house. The reason was he wanted to show society how degraded we've become, that he could kill, and he could set someone up, and he could watch society jump all over that innocent man and then execute him. And in the end, you're wrong. And it would show that we have become so dark in society that this is just a repeat of history, going all the way back to ancient Egyptian history, which was what the Zodiac was always based on. And it was the revelation of we're dark. We're in a very dark spot. And, we sit here and fight ISIS in America. Well, ISIS was actually an ancient Egyptian god, female god. And he portrayed ancient Egyptian gods his whole life, trying to exact his revenge and his religious views on us.
Now, I also wanted just to mention, I did talk about all of the source documents, original source documents, and I find that very exciting to have that kind of information to go along with this compelling argument, basically, to state your case by case. And so it's very entertaining. I mean, it's really, you got two guys that are on a massive murder mystery that unprecedented, and you have this constant source material from Metamorphosis of a criminal, which you include in your fine book, and the letters and the cryptograms and everything that you want to do to support your case. So it's incredible for true crime fans to be able to read something like this, which is unusual to have these kinds of documents and this kind of proof, and you have to painstakingly state your case here. So it's very different type of book. So it's I congratulate you on this case-by-case analysis in a very, very unique way, but very, very entertaining. So for those people that have been contacting you and maybe as a result of this want to find out a little bit more about this fascinating book, this case, or like I say, some of this original source documentation, or just the incredible past where there's all these videos where he was on to tell the truth and these great photographs that are contained in your book. So how could they contact you, John, for more information, or if they wanted to correspond with you personally?
I have a website called www.coldcasecameron.com. And what that website is my timeline that I did of Edward's life. And it goes through every decade, 30s all the way up to 2011 when he died. And it actually puts a lot more of the documents I have. I couldn't possibly put them all in the book because there's so many. But I've linked up that website to his entire life and all the evidence and documentation. And that website is a growing thing. So if anybody wants to read Edwards' book, Metamorphosis of a Criminal, there's a free copy of it on my website, a PDF file, and you can read it.
Great.
It's just amazing when you read it, because now knowing who he is, when you read what he wrote in that book, you knew he was a good con.
Yes, and it's very interesting, too, that I've never actually heard an author kind of state the claim or that this was a matter of Satanism. Everything he did was sort of a homage to Satan himself, from his past treatment as a kid in this Catholic orphanage, that everything he did had that satanic element of ruination and, like I say, wrongful convictions and executions of people that were innocent. You even have a case that you chronicle in here, Sister Margaret Paul, and we had author Fred Rosen talking about his book about that case, Satan Wore a Cross. Again, fantastic, an incredible, almost unbelievable case. Talk about the Black Dahlia and evidence to support that, and the Atlanta child killings, where, again, another wrongful conviction. You talk about people that were executed wrongfully, people that were accused, their lives were ruined, and this masterful Edward Wayne Edwards tried to provide to the world that he would become this most infamous killer of all time by providing all the clues and puzzles and proof that he was this most prolific serial killer.
That's exactly what he did. That's exactly what he did. He put it out there to be found, and he just was hoping someone to challenge him.
Well, it's incredible, too, as you state, that this case just seemed to fall into place. You were there, and very many of the stories that I've covered in this 5 years are stories like that, where a detective, a hardworking guy, just happens to pick up the phone at the right time or be there to make that, tenuous connection, but instinctually you understand from your background that, I think there's a little bit more to this. And so incredibly, you get involved inextricably in one of the most incredible cases in true crime history. So I want to thank you very much, John, for coming on and sharing with us the story of It's Me, the Edward Wayne Edwards, the serial killer you never heard of. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, Dan, for having me on.
I want to thank you very much, and you have a great evening. Good night.